Okay, well, good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Bill Lester. I'm with University of Florida IFAS Extension Service here in Hernando County, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. Tonight, we're going to be talking all about pollinators, and we have a special guest presenter, Sarah Anderson, with University of Florida, and I'll let her tell you all about herself, but let me make mention of that we're in a Zoom webinar room. So all your cameras and microphones are turned off, but you can click at the bottom where it says chat. We have the chat box is turned on. And if you have any questions as we go along, if you click down at the bottom of your screen where it says Q&A, you can go ahead and type your questions in. And then at the very end, we'll go through all the questions. We have plenty of time for getting all your questions answered. So if you have a question, go to Q&A. If it's anything else, you can go to chat. They're both on. So Sarah, I'm just going to go ahead and turn this over to you. Thank you.
Okay, great. So let's get started. First, I'm going to start out by talking a little bit about myself, of course. Here we go. So my name is Sarah Anderson, and I am with the University of Florida in the Department of Entomology and Nematology. I work in Dr. Rachel Mallinger's lab, and I am getting my PhD there. So here I have my contact information listed, and I just want to start out before we get too much into it to say that any photos that are here that do not have photo captions are all photos I've taken, and they're also available on my Instagram. So if you're interested in any of those pictures, using them for other talks or interest groups that you might be a part of, just let me know. I'm happy to share any of the material here with any of you. So with that, let me talk a little bit about what I do. So I actually do most of my research on this bee here. This is the southeastern blueberry bee. And my dissertation work at the University of Florida is focused on looking at how land use change, so conversion of land from natural habitat to agricultural and urban habitats is affecting this bee and also other pollinators. So that's a little bit about my background, and yeah, I think we can go ahead and just jump right into it. So at any point, if you can't hear me, please let me know, put it in the chat, or if there's an issue with my screen, just please let me know. So today we are going to start out, I'm just trying to get things arranged here, by talking a little bit about the diversity of bees. We're going to talk about why bees are important, and then I'll move into discussing a little bit about what we can do as individuals to conserve bees. So providing floral resources, nesting habitat, and protection for bees. And then at the end, I'll obviously take questions that you have. I have a list of additional resources, and then I think that Bill wants to talk a little bit about some upcoming events. So with that, I'd actually like everybody, if possible, to participate in a poll, a pre-test poll. So these are questions that are going to come up a little bit as we go, and we'll talk about them. Are you all able to see the poll? Great. Okay. Thank you, Lisa. Great. I'm starting to see people's votes come in. That's wonderful. Great, so we'll just give a couple more minutes here. Almost everyone has voted. All right, so we've had a couple new joiners. Hi, everybody. I'm Sarah Anderson. I'm a PhD student at the University of Florida, and right now we're just doing a little pre-test so that I can get a gauge of where everybody's at, and we're going to go through the answers to this poll as we go along in the presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and close out the poll because it looks like people have stopped voting. So you should be able to see the results of the poll for yourself. Um, is that true? Can everybody see their own results? Okay. Here we go. Are you able to see them now? Okay, great. Okay, they should be coming up here soon for everyone. So we're going to keep these in mind, and I don't want them to be in the way for you. So if they are, you can just click the little red box and it should make the poll disappear, but I'll have the results and we'll talk about them as we go along. So, all right, thank you everybody for participating. It looks like we have a pretty diverse background of incoming knowledge, so that's exciting. Okay, so the first question on the poll was how many bee species are there? And the reason I ask this is because I think a lot of us are familiar with honeybees. And in addition, many of us might be familiar with bumblebees. However, there are lots and lots and lots of bee species in the world. So the first couple of questions on the poll were just kind of to get a gauge, where are we? So in Florida, the first question was, how many bee species are there? And most people answered that, so 62% of people say that there are 300 bee species in Florida, and then the remaining 38% say that there are 20. So as many of us know, there are in fact over 300 bee species here in Florida. So we're pretty lucky in this state that we have a decently diverse set of bee species, which is really wonderful. And in addition to that, we have 29 species that are endemic to Florida. So 29 species that only live here, they don't live anywhere else. And so that's really important from a conservation perspective. So the next question, how many bee species are there in the United States? And again, I think most people got this right. There are over 4,000 species in the United States. Most of these species, interestingly enough, are actually located in the southwestern and arid regions of the United States, which is surprising to many. So here we do have many, many bee species. And in the world, of course, we have over 20,000 bee species. And I think about half of the people in the audience got that right. So just to put that into perspective, so a recent study in 2016 came out in the journal PLOS One that said that there are about 18,000 bird species worldwide. And that's the largest estimate that we've ever had for the bird species. Many estimates before that lower it at around 10,000 species. So bees are an incredibly, incredibly diverse group of animals, of insects, and they're really, really important and critical for many of our ecosystems. Let's see here if I can get rid of this. Great. Okay, so, and you know what? I guess one thing that I just want to share is a little bit of what that diversity looks like. So bees come in all shapes and sizes. So like I said earlier, many of us are more familiar with bumblebees. But in addition, these are all photos I've taken of bees just here in Florida alone. There are so many bees, and it's astounding just the level of diversity that we have here in this state. And I think it's really important to recognize that. And so that's a conservation issue in and of itself, is that we have all these wonderful organisms and to make sure that we can protect those. But in addition to that, bees serve a lot of functional roles. So bees are some of the most effective pollinators. And the main reason for this is that they collect pollen and not just nectar. So, oops, skipped ahead there. So, so a lot of pollinators, like butterflies, are known for visiting and using their long tongues to access nectar, but they don't actively collect pollen. In addition, bees have a particular pollinating behavior wherein they go from flowers of the same species to other flowers of the same species, or in other words, they exhibit floral constancy. So this is a really important issue for a flower from a plant's perspective. So plants need to receive pollen from their own species. If they receive pollen from other species, it's not very helpful for them. So bees, because of this behavior of going from flower to flower in the same species, are really effective pollinators. And this is true in both natural and agricultural habitats. So in natural habitats, bees serve to maintain plant diversity. So many of our native plants are bee pollinated. And they also serve to help in seed and fruit production. So here in the top right of this slide, you can see I have a picture here of what's called shiny blueberry. So that's one of our, I think, 8 wild blueberry species here in Florida, Vicinium mercenites. And you can see that in addition to the flowers there, that there's a whole bunch of fruit. You know, this plant is just laden down with fruit. And blueberries are actually a great example of a native plant that really requires bee pollination, because it's what's called self-incompatible. So in order to make fruit, it requires pollination from animals so that pollen can be moved between plants. Bees serve a really similar purpose in agricultural habitats, wherein they pollinate plants that are self-incompatible, like cultivated blueberries, for example. And they also pollinate plants that have separate male and female flowers. So you can imagine that this would be really important for plants like squash, where you have this really large male flower and a large female flower that are totally separate from one another. So bees actually are almost entirely responsible for squash pollination, for example. Other plants that really benefit from bee pollination in agricultural habitats are melons and passion fruits. There's a whole variety, actually, and I can share a little bit more of those resources at the end of this if people are interested. So this was a question in our poll: what % of flowering plants require animal pollination? So let's just pull our poll back here. Are people able to see the poll still? Yes? Will someone put in the chat if they can see it? Great. Okay, wonderful. So, and almost everybody got this right. So yeah, 80% of flowering plant species require animal pollination. So, and that's across the board. So that's including both agricultural plants and also native or wild growing plants as well. Great. So I'm glad that we all did well on that. But they're incredibly important in multiple ecosystems. So now that we know a little bit about the diversity of bees and we've talked about why bees are important, I'd like to focus now on what we can do as individuals to help conserve bees, you know, at our homes, in our neighborhoods, community gardens, etc. So I like to think that there are 3 sort of prongs to bee conservation. So the first being floral resources. Bees exclusively consume resources from flowers as their source of nutrients throughout their entire life. So their source of protein is pollen, and their source of carbohydrate is nectar, all coming from flowers. So the floral resources that bees can find in a habitat are absolutely critical to their success. The second element is nesting habitat. So bees have a variety of nesting life history strategies that they use. Some nest in twigs, some nest in holes in the ground, some nest in large cavities. But providing nesting habitat for bees is really important because that can be a limiting factor for how many bees can persist in a certain area. And then the third thing I'm going to talk about is protection. And specifically what I'm talking about here is protection from pesticides and other chemical control agents that we use in our gardens and lawns and in broader agriculture. All right, let's get straight to it. So floral rules of thumb that I like to think about. So you want 3 species blooming at a time in a given area, and you want to plant in clumps. So the 3 species blooming at a time is because we have such a great variety of bees here that if you're trying to attract different types of bees, they have preferences in color, they have preferences in plant family. So some bees will only forage on certain plant families, and they have preferences in height. So having multiple species blooming at a time will ensure that you're getting multiple different pollinators coming to your garden. And in addition, planting in clumps is really, really important. So bees, if you can imagine, you're a bee, you're flying over an area, and there might be a few scattered dandelions or a little bit of Spanish needle here or there, but really what you're cued by are these like large indications of floral resources, because bees are incredibly efficient creatures. So they'll tend to go for larger clumps of flowers. So planting in clumps is a really effective method for attracting bees as well. So the first thing that we need to think about when we're talking about, okay, we're gonna plant for pollinators, we're gonna plant for bees specifically, is providing, like I said earlier, those 2 key nutrients. So a protein resource, which is pollen, and a nectar resource, which serves as their carbohydrate throughout their life. So pollen plants often can include native plants. These will provide lots of pollen. But one thing to be sure of whenever you're thinking about providing pollen for bees in your garden is that you're not planting sterile cultivars. So, I have this picture up here on the right of a bumblebee butt in a petunia. So many petunias, for example, are actually sterile. Not all petunia cultivars are sterile, but many of them are, so they can only provide nectar. So here I have a question in the Q&A that says, what are pollen and nectar for bees? So maybe that person could elaborate a little bit on that question. I'd love to answer it as we go along. So additionally, with pollen plants, we need to provide nectar. So this carbohydrate resource, the quick energy resource that really powers bee flight and bee foraging behavior. Now this, bees are a lot less specific on. So they will forage on a variety of plants for nectar resources. And a lot of times these can be ornamentals, and they can also be sterile. So you don't have to make sure that there's pollen in these plants in order for bees to visit them. The second key thing that we need to think about are planting for year-round blooms. So bees in Florida, and this is sort of a great problem to have, right? Here in Florida, bees are active all year. You can see them at any time of year. Not all bees are active all year, but you can see bees year-round. And additionally, we have plants that are in bloom year-round. So providing resources for bees, particularly over the late winter and early spring period, can be really critical for their success. So I have a couple suggestions here for early blooming plants. Most of these are going to be trees and shrubs. But you also need to provide late blooming plants, and a lot of these are herbaceous wildflowers. So my favorite wildflower, wildflower, we also have cultivars of it, is blanket flower for attracting bees. Oh, this is such a great question. So someone posted in the Q&A, how do you know if a plant is a sterile cultivar? So usually you can find that information online pretty easily just by looking up the cultivar name. But there are additional resources, and particularly if you're interested in getting native plants, there are a lot of really good websites for that. And a lot of times, if you're at a native nursery too, they'll be able to provide you with that information. Additionally, though, I want to mention that at the end of this talk, I actually have a couple of plant lists. So lists of trees and shrubs and herbaceous wildflowers, as well as weedy plants and cover crops, edible plants, and ornamental plants for pollinators that actually my advisor, Dr. Rachel Mallinger, put together for a previous presentation. So at the end, if people are interested in maybe taking a picture of those lists, I have them included in the PowerPoint. So just let me know at the end if you're interested in actually seeing those. So, so we're thinking about providing pollen and nectar. We're thinking about planting for blooms year-round, and we are also, and we're thinking about planting for blooms year-round. So this is actually near and dear to my heart, what I'm presenting now. This is unpublished data from a study that I conducted this past late winter, early spring. So essentially what I did is go around to 7 different urban gardens. So Lou Gardens was included. Many of you have probably been there, and Kanakaha Botanical Gardens were included. Also several extension gardens, so discovery gardens, if any of you have ever been there. And I can provide a list of the places that I was if people are interested. But essentially what I did is go through these gardens and record plant pollinator interactions. So what I found is that pentas are actually the most attractive plant for pollinators during this time. And one of the reasons for that is, of course, that pentas have an incredible number of blooms. So again, put yourself in the brain space of a bee. You know, if you're flying over an area and it's pretty sparse because it's winter, and you see this very abundant blooming bush, which is a pentas bush, then you might stop by there and collect some nectar. So additionally, some plants I want to point out in this list are African blue basil. So many of you have probably heard of this plant, but it's non-native. However, it is incredibly attractive to pollinators. And it attracts a wide variety of pollinators as well, which is one of the reasons that I like it. It is technically edible, but it doesn't really taste great in my opinion. So, and then the last plant I want to mention here is scarlet sage. So this is a native cultivar of a salvia, so a red salvia that we have here in Florida that can be really attractive for smaller bees and also bumblebees. Oh, yes. Someone posted in the chat, is this data for Florida specifically? So yes, it is. So this data was collected at 7 urban sites in North Central Florida this year. So this is specific to Florida. I went out and collected this data earlier this year. So it is very specific to Florida. So I don't know if we have guests from other places. I would assume likely everyone here is living in Florida. So in addition to thinking about pollen and nectar, providing blooms year-round, you also have to think about color with bees because they're very color-oriented. So this was actually one of the questions in the poll. So what colors are most attractive to bees? And 65% of people say yellow, white, blue, and purple. And maybe this was sort of hinted in the photographs here, but it is in fact yellow, white, blue, and purple. These are the most attractive colors for bees. Part of the reason for that is that bees actually are not able to see as well the sort of reds, so like reds and oranges can be less attractive for bees because they see more in the ultraviolet spectrum. Now there is actually some debate about that, so I'm being a little bit touchy about how strongly I word that, but bees are known to be less attracted to red plants. And then the last thing you want to think about, so pollen and nectar, blooms year-round, color, and then shape, right? So bees are shaped very differently. And my recommendation, if you're planting to try and attract a variety of pollinators, would be to plant shorter flower, so plants with shorter corollas, so like this red or this yellow one down here, because more bees will be able to access the nectar from those plants. Whereas if you look at the top right photograph, I have a picture of a honeybee butt hanging out of some soaked aloe. And you can see that it's sort of struggling to get up there into the long corolla. And you can imagine that something like a bumblebee that's much larger would not be able to access that. So thinking about planting more flat sort of faced flowers. Oh, okay. So someone earlier asked in the chat for me to clarify about pollen and nectar, and I now understand their question. So pollen and nectar are, just to clarify, the sources of bee nutrition, pollen and nectar collectively. So pollen, though, when we think about our diets, right, we eat meats and eggs and cheeses and things like that for our protein sources. And then in addition, we eat breads and other carbohydrates to get sort of our quick energy. So with bees, their protein source, their main and only protein source throughout their entire life is pollen, which is actually very high in protein. And their carbohydrate resource, so those sort of quicker energy sources, are nectar. So that's their carbohydrate. I hope that answers the Q&A question. Now I want to talk a little bit about some specialty groups that I personally love a lot. So first of all, let's talk about bumblebees. Bumblebees are everyone's favorite. They love blue and purple flowers. If you have blue and purple flowers, that's really what's most attractive for bumblebees. Additionally, flowers with short to medium length flower tubes are better. So you can see here I've got a bumblebee on plumbago in the top, and then a bumblebee on actually a wild blueberry plant down in the bottom. One of the most important things for bumblebees, though, is to provide floral resources year-round. So with this group in particular, because new queens will basically leave their old colony in late fall, the resources that they get during that time and then the resources that they get in the early spring when they start a new colony are incredibly critical for that colony's success in the future. And this is specifically applying to bumblebees. Bumblebees have a little bit of an odd life cycle compared to other bees. So making sure that you have those late fall, early spring blooming plants really is important for bumblebees. Another group that I want to talk about are Melisodes, so the longhorn bees, and these typically are Asteraceae specialists, so sunflowers and closely related plants. So they like yellow, they like flat flowers, and summer to fall bloom is really important. So earlier I mentioned the blanket flower is one of my favorites for pollinators. I actually just took this photograph 2 weekends ago at Kanappaha Botanical Gardens of a blanket flower being foraged on. Sweat bees are another really, really widely distributed group that are pretty important when we're thinking about providing floral resources for pollinators. And they like white and yellow, they like flat flowers again, small to medium-sized flowers, and a lot of times these tend to be weedy. So here you can see that I have a picture of fleabane. So there's a Halictus poii flying over some fleabane. So that's a wonderful species that we have here in Florida. And additionally, they need spring to fall blooming plants as well, because that's when they're most active. So now that we've talked a bit about the floral resources, and again, I will show those lists at the end here, in addition to talking about some of the sites that I used for that urban garden data that I showed you earlier. But now that we've talked about floral resources, let's move to nesting habitat. One of the other poll questions I have is, where do most bee species make their nests? So you can see there are two nests here displayed. And I think most people have, about half of people have this right. So most bee species actually nest in the ground. Many nest in small hollow twigs, and bumblebees and honeybees nest in large cavities, typically left by, well, I've seen bumblebees, for example, nesting in an old tortoise burrow would be an example of where bumblebees might nest. So it's, I guess, technically underground, but really it's in a large hollowed out cavity made by another organism. But most bees are ground nesting, and they dig their own nests into the ground. Let's see here. Underground. And this is a great picture. So this is the other photo besides the one of myself that I did not take that's in this presentation. So you can see here, there's a bee. So if you can imagine looking from the top up, that's where the second picture over here to the right would be. So if you're looking up and then you look down, then there's sort of a straight down hole where you might see a cavity like this. If you could take a side view underground, that's what you would see. And that's what most ground nesting bees, that's sort of a general idea of what many ground nesting bee nests might look like. So here I actually have a video of a wonderful bee that we have here in Florida called Calides thoracicus, actually excavating her own nest. And this was outside of an old apartment that I lived in. I took this video. So many different types of bees besides just the Calides will nest in the ground. So we have our mining bees, which are the Andrena species, the polyester bees. So this one that you see here digging is a polyester bee, sweat bees, and then the longhorned bees that I talked about earlier. Yes, so a question came up in the chat, can ant mounds be mistaken for bee homes? They certainly can. It is very difficult, so I'll go back to this photo here. It's really difficult sometimes to distinguish that from ants or beetles or other ground-dwelling animals. So one trick that I will use if I think that it's a bee is to actually at night, well, in the evening, right? Not at night, but in the evening, to place a clear jar or a cup over the top of the nest. And then in the morning, get up pretty early and just kind of keep an eye on it and see what comes out in the morning. That is one of my little sort of naturalist science tricks that I love to use to figure out what is actually in the ground, because it is pretty easy to mistake these things. So if you are interested in providing ground nesting habitat for bees, they need well-drained soil that is relatively bare. You want it to be in a sunny spot where there's no major disturbance. So you definitely don't want any tillage happening, because some bees' nests are not that deep, so tilling can disturb them. So this is actually a video of the bee that I work with most closely, the southeastern blueberry bee, and she is digging a ground nest. Okay, so we've talked about ground nesters. What about cavity nesters? So cavity nesters that are in small cavities, so not bumblebees or honeybees, but things that nest in twigs or hollowed out bits from other insects. So we've got leaf cutters, mason bees, and of course carpenter bees. So the carpenter bee that I have displayed here, maybe many of you have seen it. This is Xylocopa micans. This is the male, and he is really that bright orange color with the green eyes. And I just couldn't help but put a picture of them because I think they're among the most beautiful bees that we have here in Florida. If you're interested in providing some habitat for bees that nest in really small cavities, like these leaf cutters down here, then leaving some dead wood undisturbed on your property somewhere is definitely an option. So that would provide area for something like a carpenter bee that will drill its own nest, will chew into the wood itself to nest. Additionally, I'm sure many of you have seen bee houses. So there will be reeds, or like this board here, pre-drilled holes for bees to make nests in. An important thing about bee houses, though, is that you can get an accumulation of pathogens and pests. So it's really important that you line them with paper and then remove that lining every 2 to 3 years. And also move the bee house around your property if you're thinking about installing one. And again, I can answer any questions that people have about that. The last sort of prong to bee conservation is protection. So the first question that I have here is, what's the best time to spray pesticides? And I think that almost every single person got that right. So yes, that's great. 73% of people already know this, but spraying very early or very late in the day is really critical for bee protection, because that's when they're not flying. So the last thing you want to do is spray pesticides whenever bees are actively flying. Great. So very early or very late in the day. So I just wanted to provide this sort of little figure here that shows. Oh, I'm sorry, I got a bit distracted. I got a great question here in the Q&A from Laura Zorro. I hope I'm saying your last name right, Laura. You can correct me if I'm not. Who actually runs the Native Bee Facebook group that I think everybody should join if you're interested. It's a really, really wonderful group that I'm a part of. And she says, what about males that are roosting? So yes, this is true. Males will actually sleep on flowers or leaves of plants. So if you're trying to protect males, then sort of looking at the plant and making sure there are no hanging around bees before spraying is definitely an option. In addition to that, though, Laura, I'm going to talk a little bit more about using less harmful pesticides, because I think that if you do need to use pesticides or choose to for whatever reason, then some exposure is going to be unavoidable. So speaking of exposure, let's talk about exposure routes. So in like an agricultural setting where you have this mass spray of pesticides, bees can encounter pesticides through dust and spray droplets directly. They can encounter them through systemic pesticides that actually get taken up and incorporated into the plant in pollen and nectar. And they can encounter it because bees actually do drink water, so any runoff of pesticides that gets into the water. And then this last one is guttation droplets. So bees will feed sometimes from what's called honeydew, so the excrement of aphids that are feeding on plants. It's very high in sugar, and that can actually concentrate pesticides and then make it even worse for bees whenever they do access that nectar, honeydew resource. So this is something I like to say, and well, this is really more applicable to people. A lot of times people will use this to talk about people. So risk equals toxicity and exposure. So you'll see this if you go onto a farm, right? They'll say that to people who work on the farm. But it's also applicable to bees. So don't spray plants that are in bloom. That's one of the main things. And maybe, Laura, that goes back to your Q&A question about males that are roosting. Often males will roost on flowers themselves. So trying to not spray a plant when it's in bloom is really important. So I have a picture here of a plant that I think is quite beautiful and attracts many bees, but maybe you wouldn't want it in your lawn. So trying not to spray that when it's this huge glaring resource for bees to come and access, but at some other point in the year when it's not flowering is a better option. Additionally, making sure to spray in a low drift environment is really important. So you don't want wind because that can carry the pesticide onto non-target areas and then increase the exposure. And of course, minimizing chemicals is the best practice for limiting bee exposure to chemicals. Now, the other side of this equation is, of course, toxicity. So we talked about exposure, but what about toxicity? So there are pesticides that have less toxicity to bees, and the EPA actually has some really great online resources about that. So I do not personally study pesticides, but I can direct you to some places to get information on them. Additionally, thinking about not using systemic pesticides. So plants that have been treated with pesticides that they actually take up into their tissues, into their nectar and pollen, the systemic pesticides have a really high residual activity. So they can be active between 10 and 14 weeks after that pesticide is applied. So that is a very long exposure time for a bee to encounter that. Whereas other types of pesticides that are non-systemic will have a very short activity window, maybe up to a week, which would be a pretty high-end activity level. So you're really reducing the exposure whenever you don't use systemic pesticides. We have a Q&A here. See if I can pull this up. This is a good question. So Gail says, where is the best place in your yard to put a bee house and why should we move them around? So I'll answer the first part of that. So the best places in your yard, I would say a sunny spot, that is relatively, I would say, isolated from other dangling things, if that makes sense. So you don't really want to put it under a tree that has lots of leaves where ants could crawl up and then attack the bee house. You want it to sort of be a standalone and in a sunny place. And one of the reasons for moving them is to prevent that pest and pathogen buildup over the years. So yes, so and then you have a point here about a mini decorative birdhouse and not wanting to move it. So if a bee is actively using a nesting site, you want to make sure and move these things whenever the bees are not active. So wait until the next season, the dormant season in the winter, and then move your bee house. Because otherwise, to your point, you might, because bees really rely on like landmarks, visual cues to relocate their nests. So if you move it during the middle of a season, then you're right, they might not be able to find their home again, which would of course be an issue. So, and then the last point here about pesticides is looking for untreated starts or seeds. So if you purchase a plant that, or a seed that has already been treated, those are the systemic pesticides that have that really high residual activity and can be really damaging to bees and other pollinators. Now, as I'm wrapping up here, I just want to talk a little bit about community and school gardens. So if anybody's interested in funding for these things, I've got a couple funding resources listed here. So these are mini grants that can go anywhere from, I think the lowest one is $500 up to like $1,500. And they can go to fund school and community gardens, which are of course a really important educational tool for informing children about not only pollinators, but also nutrition and food sourcing in general. Let's see, we have something in the chat. So Todd says, I'm trying to plant flowers in an open area of my lawn with mostly sun exposure. We have several gopher tortoises. Is this anything I should be concerned about? That's a great question. And I would say, no, I don't think that this is something that you should be concerned about. I think that gopher tortoises and pollinators and bees probably coexist pretty okay. Now, if one of the other panelists has more information about that, I would be interested to hear it, but I wouldn't think that it would be an issue. Additionally, I think we have a Q&A here. Oh, okay, so Deborah says, what plants attract honeybees? So again, I will provide a list of plants that are the most attractive for bees at the end of this, and maybe you could take a picture with your phone or a screenshot on your computer. But there are many plants that attract honeybees, and one of the ones that I would say is the most attractive for them, that is also quite lovely and smells nice, is that African blue basil plant. So I think those can be really attractive. That will also attract other bees and wasps as well, though. Let me just move forward. Okay, and then one other thing I wanted to mention is the importance of citizen science. So if you are an avid bee watcher, if you're interested in bees, here's a couple resources that I think are really, really great for recording those bees. I have over here on the right, I actually use iNaturalist the most. So iNaturalist is for insects, animals, or other animals, and plants. So I use it because I'm interested in these other things too, and it essentially allows you to post things, get identification help, save the things you've posted in your own account, and view what other people are seeing around you if there's a particular thing that you're interested in finding. So we have a couple more questions in the Q&A. Douglas says, are honeybees and native bees attracted to mostly the same or different plants? That is a good question. And often native bees and honeybees are attracted to the same plants, particularly whenever they're collecting nectar. There are, however, some native bees that are pretty specific to certain types of plants. So where you'll see, like I showed that picture of the honeybee and the soap aloe, you'll see a honeybee going to that because there was a ton of soap aloe in that area, where you might see the longhorned bee, even if there are fewer of these flowers in the same area, sticking to only the blanket flower because it specializes on that type of pollen, and it does not have the morphological ability to actually get inside the soap aloe plant and access that nectar. And then someone anonymously said, do we have specialist bees in Central Florida, and what plants do they specialize on? That is, that's so exciting that you asked that, because the bee I study, the southeastern blueberry bee, is a very, very common specialist here in Central Florida, and it specializes on our wild native blueberry species. So I would love to talk on that more later. I don't want to take too much time. I'm sort of reaching my time limit here. But yes, we have a variety of specialist bees, including that one, which is my very favorite. So these are some of the resources that I used when making this talk. I'm happy to take more questions. I have my contact info here again, but additionally, I will give some time for people. I'll sort of click through so that people can take photos of or screenshots of those plant lists I was talking about while I answer some questions. So this is the first list, Florida trees and shrubs. So we have a question here from Teresa, who says that last year she had lots of honeybees on her spiderwort, but this year not as many, and she's wondering why. Well, and because honeybees are both wild and also, how should I put it? They're also a livestock, right? People use honeybees and they purchase them and move them around. So it may simply be the case that somebody had honeybees near you, or that there was a honeybee colony that was wild living near you and was accessing this spiderwort resource heavily, but they could have moved as a colony. So my question to that would be, are you seeing fewer honeybees overall? Yes, and Jenny says, can you go back to the resources page as well? I certainly can. So I'm going to flick back over. I think people have probably had a chance to photograph this. Okay, here's the resources page again. We have some thoughts in the chat. Wonderful. Partridge pea. Ooh, that's a great question, Jenny. I actually don't know. I've never grown partridge pea, but it is listed here, I believe. Well, I have seen many bees on it. So, and I know that it can be a great resource for bees. So here's our next plant list. These are some of those more herbaceous flowers that tend to bloom in the summer and fall and can be great resources during those times of year. Great. I hope maybe people have had time to get a picture of that. This is a list of edible plants for pollinators, so edible to us. And then, of course, they're also good resources for the pollinators. The last thing I have listed on here is cabbage. So if you let cabbage bolt, then the flowers are actually really, really, really attractive to many pollinators. So that's true for other things in that same cabbage family as well. So mustards, cabbage, broccoli, all of that. And here we have cover crops and weeds. You can see me there in a pic. And actually, this is a mustard field essentially. So that same family as cabbage, and there's pollinators all over it, which is why I'm out there. Okay, and then the last thing are ornamentals for pollinators. So, and some of these were of course listed in that the graph that I showed earlier of the work that I did this spring. Great, so I think everyone has had the chance to get a picture of these things, and I'm open to more questions if people have them. I also just wanted to mention that, I know I mentioned this before, but I'm involved in a couple Facebook groups that I think you all might really, really be interested in. So the first one is the Florida Native Bees Facebook group. So Laura, who's on here right now, actually runs that and is she herself is a really wonderful resource for all things pollinator. And you can post in there. It's really, really great. It's a wonderful community. I would definitely recommend it. Additionally to that Facebook group, I'm in Florida Native Gardening, which is, again, just a fabulous resource if you're interested in plants. And then the final one I wanted to mention is Flora, and Ecosystematics. Florida, Flora, and Ecosystematics, which is a great group for any plant enthusiast here in Florida. And again, all of these groups are wonderful for identification and recommendations. So I will actually put those in the chat. I will write them here, the names, so that everybody can see. Here we go. So Florida Native Bees is the first Facebook group. Florida Native Gardening, and Florida, Flora, and Ecosystematics. Not sure if I spelled ecosystematics right, but I think that's okay. I think maybe we have one more. Oh, yes. Beech verbena is definitely a good pollinator for wildflower, or for, yes, it's a good wildflower pollinator plant. There we go. You can see it's listed here. And it's very common in many of the gardens that I've worked in this spring. Okay, so with that, I think that I will close out unless there are any more questions that come up.
Okay, wow, that was great, Sarah. Very, very impressive. I'm kind of embarrassed to say I learned a few new things this evening too.
Good.
And yes, we get a lot of phone calls at the office, and I talk to a lot of people that have little holes in their yard and they don't know what it is. So I know a lot of times.
Well, that's my recommendation.
Wasps are very, very important in the environment also. Nobody likes wasps, but they're very, very important.
Very.
And while everybody's thinking up and typing in their last couple questions here, just want to make a real quick mention of, if you enjoyed this class and you want to follow along and get an idea of all the other things that we have coming up, all of our classes, workshops, we do them on Zoom, we do them on Facebook Live. Sometimes we do it on Zoom and Facebook Live at the same time. If you go to hernandoextension.com, and that is in your chat box. If you click on the chat box to scroll back too close to the beginning, hernandoextension.com, that's a full listing. It's fed to a web page from our Facebook page. So that's our most up-to-date listing of all of our different classes coming up. I want to remind everybody, Thursday morning, every Thursday morning now at 10 a.m., we have our virtual plant clinic, which is where you can go on there and you can ask your questions, share pictures, email me pictures in advance. If you need any more information on that, if you contact our office, we do that on Zoom every Thursday morning to help answer questions. It's been a really big help since the office has been closed, and we're still a little bit limited to how many people we can have come in and ask questions. So it's a great way to learn and get all your questions answered. And I try to give one evening class every month. I think it's really great for people that have to work for a living and can't join us during the day. So next month, July 14th at 6:30 p.m., we're going to have a special guest, Danae Wolf, who is an expert on insect photography. She's going to be giving a workshop on macro photography. She's given TED Talks before. She has a website, and she'll be coming to us from Ohio State. So Sarah, you may want to tune back in for that one. I've been to her website, and she has some pretty amazing pictures of little teeny tiny insects. And from somebody who is not a photographer at all, because I'm not a photographer, I'm very impressed. And she'll tell you all her secrets and how to go about doing it. And I guarantee you I'm going to learn a lot from that class. So I think that's about all I really had to share. I'm sure there's probably a few more questions on here.
Yeah, sure. I can answer some more questions. So Joanne asked a question about when I was talking about the bee houses and the paper lining. So I'm going to sort of make a makeshift image of what that would look like. So if you have a bee house and each of these pins represents a reed in your bee house, then let's take one of the reeds. Then they actually make paper linings, so tiny paper tubes that fit inside of the reeds so that you can remove them to prevent any pest and pathogen buildup. So I think you can make them yourself pretty easily. You just roll up the paper and put it inside, and then bees will nest in there, and you can remove it after every couple of years so that you don't have that issue. And I also wanted to go back and show my contact information here. So if you want to, you are welcome to email me. Additionally, you can follow me on Instagram and message me there. I'm pretty active on Instagram as well. So yeah, I'm really happy to be in contact with people.
So you're a people person and not just a bug person.
Right, I am a people person and not just a bug person. So somebody actually asked a question in the chat. Do wasps eat monarch caterpillars? I think they can, yes. I think that they can, although I'm not sure how big of an issue it is like on a population level. But wasps do eat and parasitize, so lay their eggs in caterpillars often, in fact. So
yes, we have a lot of different wasps. I know people who are trying to raise either Gulf fritillary or monarch butterflies. If you have too many caterpillars in your yard or in one area, you're going to get a lot of wasps, because the wasps, paper wasps in their nest, every little cell has a caterpillar in it. It's all different caterpillars, not just monarchs. They'll catch a wide variety of caterpillars, but they do lay their eggs in them. And we have a huge number of other species of wasps that catch anything from cicadas to beetle grubs. I identified a horse guard wasp before, and they make holes in the ground, just like ground nesting bees do. And what they do is they catch horse flies and carry them off into their nests and lay eggs in them. So a lot of wasps, they catch a lot of different insects. They're all important to keep everything in balance and under control. So don't be out there.
Additionally, wasps are very important pollinators as well. So there are actually certain plants that can only be pollinated by wasps. And wasps are sort of like butterflies in that they're not actively collecting pollen, but they do get a lot of pollen on them when they visit flowers. So they're pretty important too.
So they're all important. Some people try to be really specific. Well, I like butterflies and I like, bumblebees, but I don't like all these other things. Let's get rid of them. No, you need to have a nice wide variety and balance in your yard. That way everything works correctly. Because I know I get most of my questions from people that knock that balance out of place, and all of a sudden they have huge problems, and it's because they eliminated something from the mix. So I see Mary Jo says assassin bugs will eat the monarch caterpillars. Yes, they will. There's a lot of things that eat different caterpillars. Everything from monarch caterpillars that we want to raise to the pest ones that are going to eat your tomato plants and everything else. So I think we're going to have to invite Sarah back here again sometime to do another presentation. You could do part 2 or different facets.
Certainly. Yeah, we, our lab does many presentations on all things bee, really. So I'd be happy to give a talk on identifying bees from other things, talking a little bit more about diversity, specifically talking about crop pollination, any of those things.
That'd be great. We'll have to work you back in on the schedule really soon. So does anybody have any final questions here?
Let's see, let me just check the Q&A. Doesn't seem like it. Thank you everybody for attending the presentation. I'm really happy that we had a good turnout. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you very much, everybody. We really appreciate it. And like I said, go to hernandoextension.com and you can look over the list of all the other classes that I teach, or I bring in guest presenters, and everybody else in our office does also.